Hello, everyone, and welcome to a Tortoise ThinkIn, which perhaps like no other is in our home away from home. We're talking about the rights and responsibilities in the workplace. And I'm really pleased that, if you like, we're talking about it with a range of people who understand the very different challenges that we're all now beginning to think about. But the reason that I'm smiling is that Enrico Sanna, who's the co-founder of Fora, is here. Hi, Enrico. And if it sounds as though I'm a little familiar with him, I am, because we built our newsroom in his building. This is the first time we've done a digital ThinkIn together. And so I talk about a home from home because before COVID, all of our newsroom ThinkIns were in Fora, and we shared in the building of that building a lot of discussion about what it was to create an environment that was not just good for people to work and come up with great ideas, but a place that would be an open newsroom and a welcoming one. And so now we have a bigger and different discussion, which is not just a place that is open and welcoming, but that is responsible and safe. And in the course of the next hour, what we really want to do in the conversation with Enrico, but with Gavin Davis of the GMB, we're really grateful to you, Gavin, for sparing the time to be here, and with Tracey Hudson, who's the executive director of the HR department. Absolutely brilliant name. I once thought about whether or not there'd actually be a TV show called the HR department. So Tracey, maybe we should think about that idea as well. But to try and hear from as many people as possible, both what they're seeing in terms of the way companies and workplaces are trying to deal responsibly with employees and colleagues. Frankly, we're journalists, so we're got the eye out for a story where you see companies and workplaces that are not dealing responsibly. We want to know about that. And we realize we're trying to do something which is difficult tonight because there's such an enormous range. Before we started, I was just saying to Gavin, you know, we started the week with an investigation into what had happened at the Ministry of Justice and the death of Emmanuel Gomez. And, you know, we're really proud that the journalism and the meticulous reporting by Jack Schenker prompted first David Lammy and Labour to call for an investigation into what happened to the cleaners working at the Ministry of Justice, and more recently today, a response and a pledge to deal with their unpaid sick pay by the Ministry of Justice and OCS responsible for the cleaning. But it points to the fact that there are many, many different experiences of business and the workplace. And there are those people who've looked at the lockdown and COVID and who have serious concerns about furloughing schemes, safety in factories and offices. And then there's another world which is thinking, well, how does my new digital life mesh with my office? How is a workspace going to be the best place to meet and share ideas, but also make the most of the working from home revolution? And so we realize we're talking about a big range of different experiences, but the nature of a ThinkIn, it's an open news meeting, and we're supposed to get ideas from all sides and then try and come, thanks to what we hear from you, with a better informed point of view. So if you've not been to a ThinkIn before, there's one really simple rule, which is no questions. We want to hear what you think. Tell us your experience and your point of view. And so please do just weigh in, and as ever, do it in the chat, do it by raising your hand digitally through the participants tab. My terrific colleague, Liz Mosley, who I see according to the chat is wearing a great scarf. Indeed, fantastic. Is here, so she will also respond to some of that chat and certainly flag things up for me that I should be following up on. So let's start, if we can, Gavin, with you, because I'd like to start, if you like, at the role of business and workplaces as regards fundamental rights, those rights for personal safety, but also adherence to the law as regards pay. We saw the story over the weekend about some of the factories that were said to be supplying Boohoo, the high street retailer, or the online retailer, sorry, and obviously our story into the Ministry of Justice and OCS. Tell us from your point of view, from the GMB's point of view, how concerned are you about workers' rights and the impact of coronavirus and on what's happened to workers' rights, and where you are concerned, what should we be looking at in particular?
Yeah, thank you, James. Absolutely happy to do that. The first thing to sort of like say, for those of you that don't know, GMB is a general union, so we have members in lots of different sectors. So we see it all, from the good, the bad and the ugly. So with regards to workers' rights, the first thing I'd like to say is there's growing concern about how the furlough scheme is being operated. Some companies are using the furlough scheme as a way of reducing their workforce, making people redundant. And in some cases, you'll see that British Airways are even suggesting that staff may have to work their notice period while furloughed, with making mass redundancies. So that there's a growing concern that we've got with the application of the furlough scheme. In addition to that, there's as many companies that implement the furlough scheme from a point of view that they think that if I furlough the workers, we can then get them to come to work and do some work for us whilst they're on furlough. So the taxpayers actually paying the wages and the companies making maximum profits, and we're calling upon the government to bring those companies to justice. And then obviously the big concern for us is we deal with the NHS workers and frontline staff. When you go into the medical bays, you see they're all protected, they're all gowned up. What people don't see is the backroom people, like the cleaners and the porters, that are running around not so protected in some of these places, many of whom, like the case that you've had, there's been campaigns where there's been no sick pay, and we're seeing record amounts of infection. And actually, the statistics now say that if you are a cleaner or a porter in a hospital, you've got the highest immunity level to the virus. And we would argue that's because they've been the most exposed. And these people, these workers are not being put, there's no safety measures being put in place. There's not enough PPE. There is PPE, but there's not enough. The supply chains are struggling because everything's on lockdown. And for us, then workers right across the board are being put at risk. And obviously there's now a growing culture where if you analyse someone's role and you analyse the government guidelines, they're doing what we call bubble jumping, where
what's that?
Where you jump, where you the government say that you're only supposed to be in certain amount of bubbles with people with regards to being safe. But when you're a worker working in a hospital, they can go into an infected ward and then a non-infected ward, and essentially mixing with more people. And we call that bubble jumping, where they're going from one bubble where it's contained into another bubble where it might not be contained. And then there's obviously cross-contamination. And early reports today suggest, and I can't verify this, so this might not be fact, but I've reason to believe from our members that they've had to close the A&E department at Hillingdon Hospital because they've had a COVID outbreak. So, you know, you look at stuff like that and think, how's this happening? So companies do have to invest in the security of their workers. And in some cases, you see the social distancing or the stripes outside where everyone keeps 2 meters. But then when you go in and see the background staff, then the social distancing goes out the window.
Yeah.
And that for us is like major concerns. And all companies everywhere are obliged to make sure their workers are protected. And we see so many that are not. You know, there's road companies that do road maintenance where you'll get 3 or 4 people sitting in the truck that's going to fix the road. So when they're out doing the maintenance, they're completely distanced, but yet they're going in the same vehicle to get there. So loads of companies need to be brought to task about the way they're fraudulently using the furlough scheme, the fraudulent use of public money, and also where members and staff have generally put at risk. They have to be accountable for that.
So Gavin, can I just ask you though, can we focus particularly on the safety issue and the responsibility? Because there are 2 elements to that that are really unclear to me. One is the financial support that people are getting if they are sick or if they are contacted by test and trace, and whether or not that the financial support itself is sufficient. Because if it's not, people will just come to work, and that's going to increase the risk of infection. And then the second thing is the point you're making about exposure of people like porters in hospitals, who are much more in the front line, and whether or not there are specific protections that can be put in place. I imagine it's very difficult for people, working in those kinds of environments. But I'm just interested to know what the GMB thinks could or should be done for people in those circumstances.
I mean, firstly, you've got to make sure that there's enough PPE. And actually, being honest, the GMB's view on it is, it's all well and good having the PPE available. You have to make sure the staff fully understand, because what people don't realise is people are human beings, and human nature takes over. And sometimes someone's individual understanding of why am I wearing the face mask, when I wear the face mask, when I put the protective clothing on, and when I don't do that. Sometimes if the understanding's not there and people aren't trained how to use the equipment properly, they could accidentally put themselves at risk. And our thing is that we want companies to take responsibility, like you said, and make sure it's okay putting the signs up, it's okay providing the PPE, but absolutely make sure that people wear the face masks properly. So, for instance, you're wearing a face mask, and statistically, everybody knows if someone was to cough, you are more likely to catch something through your eye socket than you are from inhaling a droplet. So if you've got a face mask on and your eyes are exposed, and someone that's come into contact with the virus sneezes with hay fever and is a carrier and doesn't realise it, you can absorb that through your eyes.
Yeah.
So, and then as well, if you're not wearing the PPE properly, you're more at risk. So from our point of view, a lot of work needs to be done from companies to make sure their staff are fully briefed on what the PPE is there for, when they are to use it, and more importantly, how it is used.
Right. Well, we'll certainly come back to that, and I'm sure that in talking to Enrico and a bit about planning for office spaces, we'll definitely talk about that. Before I do, can I just bring Tracey in? Tracey, thank you. Thanks for joining us this evening. I suppose one of the things that's really difficult here is that, talking personally, I find myself getting really confused by a lot of this, right? And then the risk is that we get into a blame game, right? And where are our individual responsibilities in this? Where are our corporate responsibilities? If you could get the entire country's HR departments in a room and say, right, this is the way to handle this, what would you tell them?
Well, it's really interesting speaking to Gavin, actually. I've only just calmed down from a LinkedIn rant that I had a couple of weeks ago about Pimlico plumbers and abusing the scheme. So thanks, Gavin, because you've riled me up again and reminded me about it. And I feel your pain I know the GMB deals with much bigger businesses. My kind of remit is smaller businesses. So I'm looking at the SME market, and my view on it with the smaller businesses, and I know I'm talking about our clients, so these are a different kind of company because they're companies that consciously want to do things properly, which is why they have outsourced HR support. So I do appreciate that. But there is a lot of fear from business owners and a lot of worry about, I want to protect my people, I want to do the right thing. And in the last couple of weeks, as people have been going back into the offices, we've done everything right. People have done videos. This is where you walk in. Imagine you're going to come into the car park. This is where you park your car. You're going to walk in here. At lunchtime, this is what you do. This is the microwave rota. This is the toilet rota. Just every detail. And yet still, employees are coming in going, no, I don't feel safe. No, this isn't right. Yeah. And employers are feeling hugely responsible because, I've got to look after people and this is my responsibility. And actually, these employers are doing everything that they should be doing. They're following government guidance. They're investing money in appropriate PPE. They are allowing people to work from home or expanding office, taking on bigger office space so that there can be distance. This is quite a big financial investment for small business owners. But employees have responsibility. An employee, I don't think it's reasonable for an employee to come into a workplace and go, no, don't feel safe, I'm off. Actually, what I would love for those employees to go, to do is say, you know, no, I'm not comfortable, and this is why. And then sit around and have a conversation. Okay, so what can we do to make it comfortable? Or actually, are we trying to do something that we just can't do here? But I think, and I don't think that's that employees don't are just being difficult. I think everybody is scared. They're genuinely fearful, and what that means is hostility is building, and people are worried, like they because of this whole blame culture, employers are thinking, oh my God, I'm going to get sued. And employees are thinking, I'm going to contract this virus and someone's got to still pay my mortgage. So who's going to do that?
Well, I'm going to pick up on a couple of different elements of this. I'd love to talk a little bit about the cost, because people often talk about what businesses need to do for them, but how do they sustain the cost of all of this? There's some really interesting points. I'd love to come to Paul Lee in a moment about not the business that you see, if you like, on the high street, but the service contractors, the supply chains. Before I come to Enrico, though, I just want to bring in Tim Rawlins, because I suppose, Tim, you were making a point in a similar spirit, which is, you know, what happens if I'm out on quote unquote Independence Day at the pub, you know, hugging in the street, and then I'm behaving in a way that's hyper cautious in the workplace? How do you marry those things? So if you want to talk a little bit about what you were driving at, that comment in the chat about personal responsibility and business responsibility.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, James. I think there's a couple of points, and I think one of the first ones is that people generally are absolutely terrible at assessing levels of risk. We see this across, you know, multiple environments. As I've commented before on sort of cybersecurity issues, people are terrible at assessing the risk of the threat to them. And I think in this particular case, we've got a very similar situation. The personal responsibility of individuals in their own life when they're out socializing with friends. And we've seen, you know, I live down the road from Wandsworth Common. We have seen mass gatherings of people around on the common, sitting together in huge groups, no social distancing, not in bubbles, nothing like that. The very same people then going, oh, actually, I feel unsafe going to work, and complaining about the issue of, well, my company's not doing enough for me. And I'm really concerned that, yes, those companies that are failing to do the right thing and making it easy to do the right thing are, of course, not living up to their own social responsibilities. But my real concern is that the individuals themselves aren't matching that level of effort. And certainly I've seen, because I talk to a lot of different companies, I've seen them really bending over backwards to try and do the right thing. And yet the people themselves are letting them down.
I think that's really interesting, Tim. One of the things that's also really interesting is how blurry the whole world of liability is on this front. So where does it sit? Causes an enormous amount of strain. Tracey, I'm going to come back to you, as I said, on those contractor points and on the points too about supply chains. But I just wanted to pick up on the point you're making about the things that businesses are doing, and come to Enrico. If you're there. So is Enrico there? Where is that? There he is. Yeah, hello. Hey, Enrico. So you know, I popped into our offices on East Castle Street, and, you know, sparing your blushes, the truth is that's amazing, right? You walk in, you know, there's someone to test you. There's a place that you can check your hands. Everywhere on the floor, you know, instructs you on 2 meters distancing. At every doorpost, there's something, again, you can sanitize your hands. You know, I've never felt quite so instructed or advised, if you like, in a workplace. And then as I left the building, I thought two things. I thought, oh my God, one, how much does it cost them? You know, what's the cost for business on this? And the second is our workspaces, our offices going to be economically viable for people, not for you in terms of the owner of the office space, but for people renting office spaces, when there's going to have to be such a degree of distance between people? And are we, in effect, asking businesses to take on a set of responsibilities that are in effect uneconomic, that are going to fundamentally damage the business? So we tell us a little bit how you've tried to weigh it and approach it.
Well, so I wear two hats, right? One is I'm an employer of many people who work at Fora. Mm-hmm. same time, we are manager of workspaces, so we cater to hundreds of companies, thousands of employees. So let me answer with the second half first on your question. It is very expensive to do everything we've done. Is expensive. It needs to be done, though. There is no halfway around it. We set up a medical advisory board because there's a lot of confusion out there on face mask, on tests, on all the things. So we felt we had to do it, be guided by people who do this for a living. So we set up a medical advisory board with the Cleveland Clinic, went through procedures. We invested in equipment, including thermal imaging cameras at every entrance, washing bases, and everything else. Because of our model is one where there are multi-tenanted offices, it is expensive, but on a per person basis is doable, I think. But you need to have, it's not just a question of money. I think you need to have a quality approach to this that ensures that people feel safe the way you felt safe when you were in our spaces. I don't think, the point you make about economics, I think it's a question of social distancing in space and ratio of space to employee and everything else. And to tell you the truth, I don't think that has played out as perhaps people think. I think what's going to change dramatically is I think the working from home will be a very good option for many people. Yes. And so I think it is about having potentially less space, but space that really, really works for the things you need to do in an office, right? So I don't believe that people would just need way more space than what they've been used to.
So just out of interest, do you think then that the world, I mean, maybe you want to think this, but do you really think that the world of the workplace, of offices, is going to change, and that there's going to be such a fundamental shift towards more working from home that overall in London and across the UK, you're going to see people move out of large permanently rented spaces into much more flexible working places? I imagine you may be hoping that, but do you think that's actually true?
I think it's really, really hard in the middle of the crisis that we're in to extrapolate the crisis into perpetuity.
Yeah.
As you know, James, before doing this, I work in financial services in banking, and I was in the middle of the financial crisis and helped Deutsche Bank restructure all its operations in the middle of it. And people were saying it's the end of banking, it's the end of derivatives, it's the end of this and that. And it turned out that none of those predictions were correct. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really hard now when everybody's sitting at home. It's pretty easy to say, oh, nobody needs an office.
Yeah.
The reality, as you know, because you and I had this conversation in the past, is people sometimes rather be at a Starbucks and work at a Starbucks than be in their own office. It doesn't say that Starbucks is a good office. It just said that their office is a bad office. My view is, if the office doesn't change, if the office is not fit for purpose, if the office doesn't up the standards so that it is an interesting, productive, healthy work environment, then the office has no space in the employee's life. But I think that many people realize, and many of our clients do for sure, and even many large enterprises, that the office needs to be of a certain quality, and its use is to gather people.
Yeah.
And that no Zoom, no technology, because we're looking at all kinds of technology, as you can imagine, can replace a face-to-face meeting, can replace the creative process that happens when people come together. So I think offices have a purpose, but many offices are not fit for purpose.
Well, Enrico, thanks. I'm gonna just come back to Tracey, if I might, and then I'm gonna turn to Paul Lee. Tracey, what do you feel about the responsibilities of business? Because one of the things that is also striking here is, we've all became, armchair epidemiologists in this, right? And now we're going to become armchair health and safety executive, right? And this stuff is really complicated. And, how do you advise small companies, right, who are just trying to make their businesses work? Where do they go for the best advice on this?
Yeah, actually, the HSE has been pretty good with giving out guidance for this stuff. It's been pretty useful. And in a small business where you maybe just have one office, or, you know, you've got an office in a warehouse or something. It's actually quite simple in terms of what you need to do. The challenge comes because actually there is a cost. And when you're a small business, I've got clients who have been a retailer, for example, who's hasn't been making any money, has had to invest quite a lot in terms of signage and, you know, perspex, protective screens and all that sort of stuff. And they're having to put it on credit cards because they just have run out of cash. Right. And that's the limit of their overdraft. So it's those businesses that I worry about. But I think in terms of what you've actually got to do, HSE are actually being pretty good in terms of the support and the guidance. There's a helpline you can ring. For small businesses, it's straightforward. I think Gavin's going to have probably quite an interesting job because, you know, just thinking about Tesco, for example, you can drive past a Tesco and look at how great everyone's queuing and, oh, look at the hand sanitizer and, oh, there's a man who's scrubbing down trolleys, how lovely. And you walk inside Tesco's and it's just a bloodbath of hell. I mean, I hate
I'm not sure it's that, but I know what you mean.
It is. Supermarkets are just bloodbaths of hell. So God, you know, if that's what the kind of the general public are walking into, and Tesco are comfortable with people not following a one-way system and all of this sort of stuff, then imagine what's going on behind the scenes. I have nothing against Tesco.
I have to say, I went to Tesco the other day. I thought it was amazing, actually. And I have sort of remarkable admiration for the people who somehow managed to orchestrate the dance of shoppers around. So I don't know. I'm going to come to your nearby Tesco and compare notes, Tracey. But can I just bring in Paul Lee, because on that note, I think the thing that was really striking to me about, and forgive me for pointing people towards the Jack Schenker piece at the beginning of the week, the thing that was really striking to me about it was that sort of sense of being lost in this demi-world where you work at the Ministry of Justice as a cleaner, you can't get hold of the person OCS to resolve your problem. If you speak to the MOJ, they say, no, our contractor is OCS. And it's really hard to work out who actually sits on the responsibility for their workers. So I was just interested, Paul, in your point about, you know, contract service providers and supply chains and what you think about this and frankly also where you think we should explore it.
Thanks, James, and kudos for a fantastic story earlier in the week. I thought that was a brilliant bit of reporting. Yeah, the point was simply that this issue is as much a challenge for procurement teams within businesses as it is for HR teams. You know, so many of these issues turn up in outsourced services such as cleaning, or in the supply chains. I mean, Boohoo is just the latest example. And it does seem as though too many businesses, in effect, outsource the problem and are not paying enough for workers down the system to be paid properly, to be protected properly.
Yeah, I think there's a big conversation that will come here. It was really interesting, I thought, within about 5 or 6 weeks of COVID, it suddenly became fashionable to talk about global supply chains, right? How reliant we were on China. And I think what's just catching up with us is our domestic supply chains that are just mostly unseen. You know, I'm going to go back to Gavin in a moment, because one of the things that strikes me is the financial support for people who are unseen, but backing, let's say, the hospitality industry or other sectors that are not necessarily going to be working at full capacity for a long time. And that's where this meets, presumably, big financial pressure and also, at the same time, you know, responsibilities for safety. So, well, Paul, thank you for bringing it up. And it's a very difficult subject, honestly, to do journalistically, because it's not high profile. Most people don't know those companies, but we'll try and think about it. I'm going to try and bring in Jarina Chowdhury. Jarina, forgive me, I don't know whether or not it's a hard J or not a hard J. Have I pronounced it right?
Yeah, you have. Thank you.
So Jarina, I was really interested in your point about sort of a big shift in the way individuals think about the workplace, and not just the workplace, but cities. Is that because you're thinking differently, or you think that something is afoot?
I think that something is afoot because I work in a charity. It's based in King's Cross. We've been allowed to work from home. Not many of us have taken it up because we like to go into the office for the social interaction. But I think that with the pandemic, you know, we had to close our building on the 17th of March, and we haven't been back since, and can't see when we will be going back in the near future. And we've proved just by this that we can work from home. So all of the kind of griping and kind of, oh, I can't work from home and I need to be around people. I mean, it's been difficult. We've managed with the technology we have. I think that there are probably unfair assumptions as well made by employers that everybody has super fast Wi-Fi. You know, we're all busy on webinars for work reasons, you know, during the day. And some people that I work with are living in house shares, some of the younger people. And so they're all working from home too, and they're all kind of using up the Wi-Fi. And so, yeah, it's challenging for people. And I think employers have, you know, in the pace of everything that we've had to do, perhaps employers haven't been so kind of understanding or aware that not everyone has access to the same resources. But for me, I mean, I actually moved quite far from where I work. I'm still in London, but I moved about 18 months ago. And my heartache was I couldn't find a way to cycle to King's Cross without going down the Euston Road. And then this pandemic came along and I thought, well, hey, I can just work from home now. So, I mean, there's some really funny little stories coming out of this. And I just wonder whether now that, you know, it's not just us that are doing this, so many people are now working from home, whether that will change the kind of flow of migration to cities, whether rents might come down in time and be a bit more reasonable for people, whether, you know, things like the digital divide, you know, there's some parts of the UK where you can't get Wi-Fi. It's ridiculous if you're not in a city. And I'm just wondering whether those places around the UK that have been neglected in terms of infrastructure for years, they might now have a bit more resource put their way, because people will need to be working from there. And obviously the economy has to be satisfied by workers beavering away. So,
Jarina, thanks so much. Just out of interest, in your charity, we were talking with the chief executive of a huge company a few weeks ago, and he was saying that the board of his own, or the management team of his own company, was completely divided between those people who wanted to be the first back to work, we're hyper competitive, we're can do, and the half the management team that says, no, let's be the last back to work. Let's show people how we can transform our working habits. Within the charity, just yours, do you think the sort of balance is, let's be last back to work? I don't mean back to work, back to the office, I mean. Or in a hurry to get back in?
I don't think we're in a hurry to get back in to prove anything, because we can all work remotely. But we do have a building in King's Cross, and we have tenants in the building, and those tenants, I imagine, have been asking for rent relief since March, because we closed the building. And I'm really interested to think about, you know, when we look at the London landscape, we see all of these amazing cranes and blinking lights in the night. These are all offices that are being built and properties that are being built. But yeah, will they be obsolete? Will they have to be completely repurposed? And my feeling is that they will have to be repurposed. And that could mean our building too.
Interesting. Okay. Jarina, thank you. Gavin, can I come back to you on this? I know this is not, you know, when you think of unions sort of fighting for people's rights and for those people who are exploited in factories, or those people whose, you know, terms and conditions are just routinely flouted, there's something frankly kind of heroic in that work. The thing that Jarina just touched on is not nearly as dramatic, but is much more pervasive. It's the person sitting on their bed with their laptop on the ironing board and really, you know, shaky Wi-Fi, trying, you know, and massively frustrated by work. Do you at the GMB, A, hear much of that, or B, have an idea of how that could be changed in terms of support for better broadband and Wi-Fi, support for people working from home? I imagine it's something you're talking about. It's interesting to know what you think on it.
So, yeah, James, that's an interesting point actually, because what people overlook is often you find the lowest paid workers are the workers that have the worst broadband because they're not fortunate enough to pay for the ultra fast packages. And the one thing that is alarming that people overlook is when you have a family that, and I'll give you a hypothetical scenario. So the family, the husband and the wife, both have to work to supply support for their children. So they're both then working from home. Then the kids are being homeschooled and they're sharing a mobile phone to do their work because they haven't got the internet packages and stuff. And no thought is given to the fact that you've got two children that are dependent on their schooling, homeschooling. You've got two parents that are trying to homework, and they're all doing it from a mobile phone. And they've just not got the facility to do that. And obviously we're experiencing, unfortunately, a lot of what employers would call reasonable management instructions that we would argue on behalf of the staff, well, they're not reasonable if you take the person's circumstance into consideration, because not everyone can just shut down in the office and take their office home with them. Mm-hmm. Like in my own house, I'm fortunate. I have two teenage boys, both homeschooling, both on the computer. My wife is currently furloughed, but normally she works from home. I'm office based and normally out and about. So I've mutated back to my house, although I'm in the office today. So when you go into my house, you've got two computers for both my boys. My wife has a computer system and I'm set up on the dining room table. And I know for people less fortunate, that's one computer that they're all struggling to work from, or in worst cases, it's a mobile phone. Yeah. And we're having discussions with employers about what do you do? It's okay just switching off and sending people home. And that's right, when we've got a pandemic, that companies do support workers like that. But what structure do you put in place for someone working at home? So you have all the health and safety, and I know Tracey will have a view on this as well. So you have all the health and safety and all the good things that some companies are doing in the workplace. When that comes to working from home, that home becomes that person's workplace. Yeah. What provisions are we putting in place there? And we're having challenges with employers saying to them, you cannot expect employees to do that because they haven't got the facilities. They didn't plan to be working from home. This is the onset of a pandemic. And again, I would agree with my colleagues, the HSE's been great, but we're seeing small businesses taking out unnecessary business loans that if the economy doesn't pick back up, they've got no chance of paying that back, and they are going to go bust, and we are going to see redundancies. And you've got people working from home that, as you rightly said, James, and the concern for us is what provisions are put in place to support them.
And the thing, I mean, look, I'll sort of show my hand here a bit. I thought one of the things that you can do, given how many people are now working from home, and if you do want to invest in the economy, one of the things you can do is provide incentives for businesses to fund the broadband of their employees, and make sure that they've got the secure, stable connections that they need. And it seems to me as though the government is still, even in the light of today's statement from the Chancellor, still trying to think through the changes in the economy that are happening. But Tracey, can I just pick up on that point? It was slightly differently from the point that Gavin was making, which is you've been saying interesting things in the chat about onboarding of people, about how people get to know each other when they work. From where you sit, how worried should we be that this period, and I'm not saying just the last 4 months, but probably the next, let's say 6 months, where there'll still be quite a high level of working from home, people's return to work will be limited, will be have a real impact on fairness around recruitment and progression, right? That people will essentially choose the people they know, and that will have a real impact on who joins businesses and how those people, even within businesses, move up and within them.
Yeah. The thing that's really surprised me actually since lockdown is the number of people who are scared of this. They're
Yes.
scared of being on a screen.
Yeah.
And they can be the most confident people who will happily present to 100 people in a room, but put them on a screen and it terrifies them, and they go, they can't speak, and they just like don't like it, or they'll turn their video off. And you know, when you're trying to interview somebody, you can interview somebody over the phone, but you want to see their face.
Yeah.
You want to be able to have that connection. And if you've got somebody who says, yes, okay, I will do an interview on Zoom. Yes. Oh no, my video is not working. I don't know what's going on. And that happens a lot. And so it is certainly a challenge of how people who are maybe a little bit more introverted or just that self-conscious that they don't want to put themselves forward via a screen, they're certainly going to lose out on opportunities. And I don't know what the answer is in terms of how you make that fair.
Yeah. At this stage, I think it's one of those things where it's just worth asking the question, because you don't know how these things will play out. I'm going to just bring in Nacho and Maurice, because I see, Nacho, you've had your hand up for a while. And also you're saying something really interesting, which I just never heard before about, hey Nacho, about bullying and about the difference between a digital work life, if you like, and an in-office work life.
Yeah, I wanted to mention the thing is that me normally I'm quite an introvert person. Sometimes in physical meetings, you have the point that the person who is more assertive with either with the tone or with the nonverbal language is the one who gets out with it. As the thing is that an introvert person can have more problems in a physical meeting, while the virtual meeting, like here, democratize it and you raise your hand and you have the same ability to express yourself. The second is in what I was commenting in the bullying. The thing is that I have suffered bullying in my career, and I'm sure that either the people would have not said what they told me, and if it was a camera between us, or otherwise I could have just press the record button and send the tape to my lawyer.
Huh, that's it. Where's Liz? Because as you're talking, Liz has said something really interesting, which is, in my experience, real life power dynamics very much translate in the video world. What do you mean, Liz?
I'm not sure that I buy this thing that if you're an introvert and you find it hard to assert yourself in a real life meeting because certain people take up the airtime, that when you take that same meeting, that same group of people and the same topic, and you translate it to video conferencing, that suddenly you would find it easier to insert yourself into the conversation to make your presence felt. I just don't. In my experience, that isn't the case. I think for the same meeting, same group of people in video, it's the power dynamics are exactly the same.
I would put it a parallel like in the video game world, where you have this very introverted, nerdy guy who then turns out to have a very powerful persona when he's in video games, and he interacts a lot with his video game buddies, etc. I think there can be a parallel between the physical workspace and the digital workspace with what happens in video games.
The interesting thing, Nacho, is one of the things we've talked a lot about in Tortoise is I'm sure that there's stuff that's in office that is different from digital. We found, or certainly I found, that there's an enormous amount of really useful non-verbal communication in an office space. So I'm really aware of it. For example, if we have an editorial meeting and I say, by the way, why don't we do this? There can be a moment in a room of half a dozen people or so where no one says anything, and yet it's absolutely clear that everyone thinks it's a bad idea. And that non-verbal communication, I think, is quite effective in a physical space. Actually, I should come to Enrico, because you've probably thought more about this than most of us. Enrico, what do you think now? Because we started talking about rules and responsibilities, but actually we're drifting into talking about the purpose of workplaces, the nature of businesses. I imagine you've thought a lot about what's the difference between working from home and what you can actually get done physically in a place with other people and colleagues. What do you think are the critical differences? What are we going to need to come to our offices for?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say that I think a lot of the arguments about working from home are made by people who have very comfortable home positions.
Yeah.
And the discussion we were having earlier about the Wi-Fi, that's a luxury problem to have. Yeah. You know, I have over 350 clients with thousands of employees in our spaces, and we just spent the past 2 weeks talking to each one of them. And there is a considerable amount of the population that needs an alternative to working from home. And they don't have the luxury of having 3 rooms where everybody can spread out or, you know, have privacy, etc. So I think again is I think people have different opinions depending on what their experience has been. I think about, you know, this technology, the way we're talking about today, and, you know, I've been in the thinkings with you in your media room, and I feel full. I feel surrounded by the activities and the conversation. On Zoom, it feels very flat, right? It feels kind of, you can't see everybody, you just see one person at a time. So I think that to me is a good example of why the face-to-face can be beaten. So you come to an office, to answer your question, in my view, is for the social interaction that I think was mentioned earlier. You come to the office because you need to understand the nonverbal part of our communication styles, because that is really what triggers the emotional intelligence that we have in us. Yeah. You also come, I think, to an office to build a culture. I don't know, I always say I could have never built a culture of Fora by video. I really think it's impossible. I think we were living on borrowed time. We built companies with a certain culture, now we're borrowing the credit we've accumulated right now while we're all on video. But you can't, into perpetuity, this thing, it'd be really hard to continue. So I think that the element of coming together and see somebody and looking at the nonverbal clues and working together shoulder by shoulder when we can be shoulder by shoulder to solve a problem, have a creative moment, that only happens in physical space, in my view. And therefore, the office is for that. It's interesting, if you look at the history of the office, right? You know, 150 years ago, people used to have a shop, and upstairs you used to have a place called an office where there was a desk, right? They used to go to the office to do administrative work. So it's true, the desk itself is still very good today to do administrative work. So I think if you're at home and you need to do some administrative work, or you need to have total concentration because you're writing something, or you know, on your own, yeah, you know, home is great. But if you collaborate,
I'm enjoying Enrico, as you're talking. Tracey put in the chat, I love video meetings purely because it's so much more efficient, less nonsense chat, work through the agenda, end call. It's kind of fantastic, brutal. Listen, I want to bring in, if I might, just before, because a couple of people in the chat have raised things which I'd love to just hear a little more personally about. One is Zebedee. I don't know if it's Albi or Albi, but Zebedee, will you just talk about your individual rights and risk assessments? And I want, if I can also, in a moment, hi Zebedee, and in a moment I'm going to follow up with Katia and her point too. But Zebedee, why don't you start?
Oh yeah, hello. Yeah, I work for Tesco in Andover, and I had to raise the subject myself. At first, the response to a request for risk assessment was turned down, saying that Tesco don't do that. But then, on the same day, the chief executive sent out an email to all Tesco employees, saying that because of the situation with the Black Lives Matter situation, that they wanted us to know that they really cared about their staff. So I was so incensed by that on that same day I got this email from the CEO. I sent him an email, and after that the managers at my Tesco store started discussing things with me and offering changes and putting in providing PPE and also putting in barriers and so on. So my question is, what about those staff who don't actually take it that far? What happens to them?
And simply, just to ask you, have you got friends or family who've had COVID-19?
No, surprisingly, I don't know anyone who's had COVID-19.
And has there been anyone in the store in Tesco in Andover that's had it?
I'm sure that there are, but we don't find out. You know.
You're not told?
No. Are you surprised by that?
Yes.
Oh.
I am surprised. Yeah, I am surprised. I'm surprised, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't know what the requirement is on the business to inform people. But you would have thought you would want to be informed in case you'd worked on that same shift with a person you might be shielding. And just Zebedee, tell me a little more. The original risk assessment that you asked for, did you ever get that?
I got it subsequently after the email to the CEO. It's done through a online risk assessment by the occupational health provider.
Right.
And you know, you answer certain questions, and presumably you notch up certain points, and based on that, you get put into a category. Either you get you stay at home secluded, or you come in with certain adjustments, or you just work as normal, I suppose.
Oh, I see. So the risk assessment is actually on your individual vulnerability and exposure. It's not an explanation of the workplace protections that have been put in place.
No, they ask you certain questions like, you know, what your age is, you know, what your weight is, whether you have diabetes and so on. And based on those answers, you know, a certain score is achieved.
Right. And did you find that helpful?
Well, I found it helpful insofar as it got me what I needed to actually feel more protected. But in terms of like doing it in the best way possible, I don't think it's the best way that you can do it, because you don't get to say, for example, on the question of diabetes, that you might be on the cusp of, you might be pre-diabetic, but not actually diabetic. So that isn't taken into account. You get a yes or no answer.
Okay. Well, Zebedee, thanks so much for telling us about that. It's really, I mean, it's interesting just understanding how big companies are dealing with this. It's also interesting to hear a little bit about how companies deal with it, and then how people like you, good enough and strong and smart enough to basically, you know, send that email, actually then get results. I mean, to an extent, it's a problem that didn't happen to begin with, but actually quite striking how quickly things happen when you do such things. So thank you. I just wanted, before we wound up, go back to Katya, if I might, because Katya said something really interesting, which, fun enough, I wondered about when I walked into Fora, which is about the whole question of data and oversight and what our new digital work life means for privacy. So can you just tell us, Katya, about your workplace and what the digital monitoring, maybe that's not the right phrase for it, but how it worked there, and what lessons you drew from it?
Well, I mean, it's like, so I work for a Silicon Valley company that, I mean, as Liz said, maybe untypically had a very, very strict no work from home policy. So you were always expected to be in the office, unless you had a very good excuse. And obviously you could tell that, but you couldn't regularly work from home. And people were very, very worried to let people work from home when COVID hit. And I think that's probably because there's a large sales force, and I think they felt the sales floors had to be full and buzzy, and managers had to make sure they could see people were picking up the phone and making dials, basically just doing the amount of calls they're supposed to do a day. And people were very worried that that was not going to happen when people were at home, but because you use technology such as Salesforce, for example, to, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with Salesforce, but you can track how many calls people do, and then there's sort of the software that was used to call those potential customers or prospect. Managers can listen into, so you can see how many calls were made. People were very, very closely tracked to see how many calls you do a day, and people who thought that was unnecessary sometimes just made empty calls, or called to get to the numbers, the minutes that they were supposed to talk, by calling like a switchboard, for example, and just letting the thing run for a while. And managers can listen into calls and pick that up when people got fired for that. So it's in my experience, it hasn't yielded, as I said, people haven't become more independent, and people haven't been returned the time. I think the time that previously went into commuting somehow seems to have gone into work as well.
Katya, thank you. While you were talking, Andrew Girdwood in the chat but put probably more succinctly than I could, privacy versus biosecurity is the battle for 2022. And without ringing my ears, I'm going to just ask Enrico, Tracey and Gavin to wind up for us. And Enrico, can I start with you? Presumably you've thought a bit about that there's now greater data coming into fora about who's coming in and out of the building and how you protect that or protect the privacy of individuals coming in.
Sure, I mean, and there's obviously a lengthy GDPR procedure that you need to follow as well, right? That protects that. I mean, simplistically putting it is, you know, we are very careful of tracking any data, and the stuff you were referring to probably, James, is, for example, we're taking temperatures of people walking into the building, but like with CCTV camera, there are signs out there saying that we're doing that, right? Everything else, we stay away from this argument that offices should collect data and analyze how people work in different ways, because we feel that that's really the employers need to decide.
Right.
Want to do that, and it's too gray of an area, I think, to really take a stand that is defensible in some instances. So we are, you know, we do things such as CCTV because obviously it's a security issue, thermal imaging for the same reason, but at the end of the day, that's the extent of which we will have anything, and anything is anonymized and not traceable to the individual.
Okay. Enrico, thank you. It is a really interesting subject. I mean, obviously the app itself has been an argument in itself about technology platforms and individual data. It's one I think probably worth exploring. Tracey, a final thought from you. What do you think that HR departments, I know you're not an HR department, but serving so many others, can best do to change the level of public fear and create a level of reassurance?
I think really communication is lacking completely. You know, we've got written risk assessments, so let's send those out to staff and that's fine, it'll make everything better and everyone will feel safe, and it doesn't quite work that way. I think that a lot of HR departments are overlooking the fact that individual people are going to have different fears and different worries and different challenges about coming back to work or working from home, whatever it might be. So certainly what we've been advising our clients is to managers to pick up one-to-one calls with every employee that works for them and talk through personally what's going on and what their fear is. But you know, in all honesty, my final thought is that I'm just devastated that bubble jumping doesn't mean something more fun.
On that subject, we'll turn to the. Who knew that we were looking to the GMB to give us, you know, not only additions to the English language, but things that sounded like something you wanted to go and do with your kids on the weekend. Gavin, a final and serious thought from you. Where would you advise us to sort of focus our energies when you're thinking about where those rules and responsibilities aren't being enforced by employers?
I mean, for me and for the union, it's always about protecting workers. And actually, a lot of focus and attention does need to go on securing people's jobs and giving people something to go back to, because there's not enough publicity out there at the moment explaining about 6 months from now. There's companies at the moment surviving and treading water, but we don't know what's going to happen in 6 months when the real impact of the job losses hit. We're at the moment, we're about 3.6 million unemployed, and some real economics specialists have said that it could get dangerously close to 5 million, and with companies in financial trouble, and some of the companies you wouldn't believe that we're in early consultation with, like for instance Lakeside, for anyone that likes shopping, the companies that run all the shopping centres, they're really struggling at the moment, and there's some real worries that actually the unemployment is going to go pop to a maximum level, and we need to make people aware of what happens tomorrow. So at the moment, loads of investments going into help business, small business loans, furlough schemes, but what happens to the economy when we have record unemployment and those people have bills to pay, mortgages to pay, families to provide for. So I would say from the union's point of view and everyone else's point of view, real effort has to be made, not to just secure jobs today, but to give people a possible future. Some people have dedicated 20 plus years to their employer and now they're looking at redundancy and they're like, well, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? I've done this. My dad did this. My grandfather did this, and now I'm facing uncertainty because this is all I know.
Yeah. Well, Gavin, thank you. I mean, I don't think there's a bigger issue in the economy now than this unemployment issue, and it, you know, I was talking to someone earlier on before we got on this call about the Chancellor's statement today and the sense that is it really of the scale that we're seeing in terms of numbers of unemployed, and I think that's a subject we're going to come back to at Tortoise to try and understand not just the scale of unemployment but where it hits and who it hits. And I suppose, just to wrap up, I think the really striking thing about this conversation is we started out talking about how very different workplaces and offices can be and the different experiences people have. There was, though, I thought, one thread that went through the whole thing, which was this idea of responsibility. You know, starting out with the point that, you know, Tim was making, Tracey talked about individual responsibility and being honest about those individual responsibilities, and then just beginning to digest the scale of what business responsibilities now are, the costs of them, the detail of them that, you know, we heard in the conversation with Enrico, and the point that Tim was making too about the scale of responsibilities that we don't see. But I suppose the biggest one is this thing that I come back to, is the sort of the national responsibility, if you like, the state's responsibility. Because when I listen to Zebedee or Katya in their own ways, I begin to think about how we're really thinking about the unevenness of the economic impact of this coronavirus, and how we're thinking about the future impacts vis-a-vis data, etc. And so I do begin to think that there is a huge range of work for us to do on that. Forgive me, I've gone on a few minutes longer, but as I said at the beginning, it's such an interesting subject and one that so directly impacts us all. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. A big thank you to you, Gavin, to you, Tracey, and to you, Enrico. Thank you all. We will see you before too long, no doubt, in our newsroom, but certainly back here on in our digital think-ins. We can't thank our great gang of wise advisors and experts tonight, but we can give them a cheerful wave goodbye. So please wave them off, and a big thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.